I have decided after looking at these lessons about David Lipscomb, I know why the writer spent so much time with him. Is one, David Lipscomb perhaps had as much, if not more, influence upon the Southern Churches of Christ than any other one individual. One was not only because of his preaching in the Nashville area, but because of the widespread acceptance of the paper that he published, the Gospel Advocate. And it reached an awful lot of folks. The Christian Standard out of Cincinnati reached an awful lot of folks. And there were other different papers that reached out to folks. I can remember years ago reading it, and I always thought that there was a section that I called the Scalp Hunting for the Lord, in which the preachers reported how many baptisms and how many restorations they had in these meetings and how glorious all this was. You know, that's neither here nor there, because most of those people I'd never met, didn't know where they were, and in a lot of the places they preached I'd never heard of before either. But that's no big deal, because they'd never heard of me either. So that's 6 and 1, half a dozen other. Next week I am going to present a lesson from me that is not in your book, and it's going to be dealing with the eldership, church, government, and a few other things that I think are important. Since we've been exposed to several things for the last 3 weeks that most of us probably don't really subscribe to as much as folks did back in Lipscomb's time, and the controversies are not as steep today as they were back in those days. I think it's just necessary that we lay down the foundation and look at what the Scriptures actually say, because as my wife expressed it this afternoon, and something that I'd already drawn the conclusion about, I think Lipscomb oftentimes was not consistent in the position that he took and what he taught versus what he was attempting to do. And so we'll talk about that a little bit more as we go on. And then also I'm going to combine chapters 15 and 16 and chapters 17 and chapters 18. I just don't think there's enough meat that is there to take up extra time on Wednesday night, and the combination of those two will fall together. The 17 and 18 are the two chapters in there on dealing with women in the church and the reflection of what was going on at this particular time. So tonight, lesson 14, we're going to talk about Lipscomb's view of what he considered faithful shepherds. The opening statement that Lipscomb made in 1871 was this one: controlling the church by the virtue of authority of office is unknown in the Scriptures. All should seek to control simply and only through the authority of truth, impressed by lives of godliness, purity, and love. Now, we'll come back to this a little bit later on as we get a little deeper into Lipscomb's thinking. But before we get into that, part of what caused him to get to this particular point is that in 1870, John D. Rockefeller incorporated the Standard Oil Company of Ohio. And within 10 years, his corporation had controlled about 90% of all of the oil business in America. When there was a Congressional Investigating Committee that met in 1886, they came to the conclusion that the Standard Oil Company brooks no competition. It its settled policy and firm determination is to crush out all who may be rash enough to enter the field against it. And surely he fairly well had a monopoly on the oil company. And later from that, as Congress has in times since have moved into areas and said this is a monopoly and it has to be broken up in order to have fair trade practices for different people in the United States. Now, most of you are probably more familiar with a more recent one when AT&T was broken up, or Southern Bell was broken up a few years ago into several small companies. Rockefeller's name became the symbol of a new form of business organization that emerged in America during the 3 decades of the 1870s, 1880s, and 1890s that followed the Civil War. One has to remember that the South was devastated. There was not a lot of industry that was here, and most of the wealth of our nation was north of the Mason-Dixon line. And so that became sort of a problem. And then a restructuring of the way the business was being done took place. And it was simply called the corporation. Now, you and I live in a day and a time when corporations are as common as Disney World, which is also a corporation. And there's so many different corporations that are around, it would be very difficult for us to be able to mention very many of them before it wouldn't maybe get in your pocketbook a little bit. Whether we work for one, whether we know of one, or that we're in competition with one, the concept of the corporation was really set forth during this particular time. One of the interesting things that took place during the ending of World War II was the basic concept and thoughts that were going on among people in America. And this was one of the jokes that kind of went around about Americans in the other places of the world. It said that if there was an American bomber that was shot down, this is not necessarily a bomber, but it was the only real good shot of a plane on fire that I could get, that as the crew would parachute out, and if they were about to land on a deserted island in the South Pacific, before they hit the ground, they would have elected a president, a vice president, a secretary, and a treasurer. And this is the way that the concept of the corporation had gotten into the minds of the average individual. Now, this is something that sets the stage for things that are going to happen as far as the church is concerned. Corporate forms of ownership had emerged in the railroad companies back in the 1850s, and by the 1870s had become commonplace. Rockefeller took this concept, made it into his own to control the oil industry, and he did a pretty good job with it. And there we see a familiar board meeting of a corporation with the presidents and the vice presidents, and they make decisions, and the business goes in the direction of whatever it is that they decide. Now, this was considerably different from the way that business was being done prior to this. The business was basically operated by the stockholders. Today, most of the corporations will have an annual meeting in which you are invited to come. They don't really want you to, but you're invited to come. And if you're not going to come, they send you a proxy for you to fill out or a vote for you to fill out, and they actually tell you who to vote for and how to vote for whatever it is that they've sent to you. Rockefeller said the day of combination is here to stay. This is the combining of concepts, the combining of businesses, and instead of having 4 to 5 small businesses, they are all grouped together under this corporation umbrella and operated in that way. He says individualism has gone and it will never return. And I don't know that he was a prophet or a son of a prophet, but certainly as far as business is concerned, that's pretty much the same. Today, if you try to begin a individual business on your own, it's kind of interesting to know that if you're not incorporated and if you don't have some help from the outside in some way, most of those businesses end up failing within the first 5 years. It's not Rockefeller either. I used to think it was Rocker. It had an R in there, but it's not. It's John Davidson Rockefeller. Very interesting man. This new corporate order of business not only transformed the way that America did business, but it began to transform cultural values. It changed the basic thinking of the way that people did business, the way that people lived. Some of you perhaps, and if you've been here for a great long period of time in Oak Ridge, lived in a corporate village. My wife grew up in Old Hickory, Tennessee, and the whole town was owned by the I.E. DuPont Corporation. And then later on, the houses were sold and they became individual homes. If you lost your job with the corporation, then you lost your housing. The same thing happened here at Oak Ridge, is that the government owned all the houses. And if you didn't work for the government, you didn't have a house. And if you lost your job with the government, you lost your house, and goodbye. You had to move out. It also changed the way that people thought. No longer did people think in individualistic terms, but they began thinking in collective terms of what was best for the groups that we belong to or that we're involved with. And even the most rationally designed skyscrapers presented themselves as statements of implacable power. Do you recognize this building? How many of you have ever been to San Francisco? Okay. What is that, Mike? Transamerica Building. Okay. Anybody know what this one is? Chrysler Building. Where is it? Where? New York City. Okay. And surely everybody will recognize this one. The president owns it. Trump Tower. What do they represent? You think of these great skyscrapers. But where did all that money come from? Some group of men, maybe even some women, met in some place at some time and said, we've got to show people how powerful we are. And these skyscrapers are a representation of that. And of course, New York is just full of these. And so are many of the other large cities that are around. It was inevitable that the corporate and managerial, I wish I looked and look at that, I spelled that wrong. That's supposed to have a D on it. I was using David Wallace's computer again. It was inevitable that the corporate and managerial revolution that was so shaped American society would also begin to affect American churches of all kinds. We might say that the Protestant denominations also followed the pattern of incorporation. Oftentimes, organizational efficiency and centralized control became key concerns of the growing urban churches, and as a result, denominational agencies and bureaucracies steadily grew. Proliferated is not one of the words that I would use very often, but they became very many of them that are around. There were several reasons for this. One, to hold control. Two, I think, was because it was a more efficient way of doing things. To give you an example, and this will be something we'll touch on next week, how many of you guys ever been to a men's business meeting where there were no elders? Fun time, right? Fun time. I I've come home frustrated many times after this type of meetings, and it's just one of those things that you just don't like. You like it when there is order, when there is an agenda that people will follow, and that there is business that is actually conducted, and most opinions are left outside the meeting itself. David Lipscomb pointed out, and at least this came through the Gospel Advocate, pointed out a very profoundly different vision of the church, even from what we see today. If he had lived today, I don't think would have been very happy. Seems like sometimes back in his day and time he wasn't very happy. But he spent for about 50 years propounding his concepts of what he thought the church was to be like and what the leadership of the church was to be like. And for over 50 years, he spoke out real sharply against the forms of organization and power that was represented by what was called the new corporate model. Not only did he become a crusty foe of the missionary societies promoted in the Restoration movement, but he also opposed the concept of an official eldership. Now, when the missionary societies were organized, they basically fell under this same concept of a corporation, and that's the way that they basically operated too. The purpose upon which they were formulated was to have a central organization for churches to send their money, to have it looked after, and then have it dispersed among missionaries in other places, and that this would be beyond the need for the local congregation to have to do this. Lipscomb did not accept that elders in the congregation were officers, because an officer, as he said, was one who is appointed to do a work which he could not do without that appointment. This is one of the areas where Lipscomb starts to become inconsistent with his argumentation and what he and proving what he had to say. His idea was that these were not basically real offices. He said that people use the term officer is one who is appointed to a work, and so a sheriff can arrest someone by authority of his office, but a person without such official power cannot. Either Lipscomb was not aware of the fact that you can make a citizen's arrest, or that law was not necessarily on the books. But you can arrest someone, but you'd better have a lot of good evidence, and you better really know what you're doing before you get involved with that, because individuals can sue you and will sue you in this day and time, which I don't think that they did quite as much in that day and time. Lipscomb was emphatic that Christ Church has no officers in this particular sense. Now, here again is another one of those areas that Lipscomb was not really solid in. He believed that elders being called officers of the church rested in a mistranslation of 1 Timothy 3 and 2. Now, it was not 1 Timothy 3 and 2, it's 1 Timothy 3 and 1. This is the second thing that I caught that they had not corrected in their second edition. 1 Timothy 3 and 1 says, "This is a true saying, that if a man desires the office of a bishop, he desires a good work." The problem of inconsistency here is knowing the concept of what an office is about. An office is about doing a work. And a work is basically a place that you have been put, or an office. And this is, I think, one of the areas that Lipscomb seemed to have missed the concept And you have to remember, too, that he's in the second generation of what's called the Restoration Movement. And many of the concepts that you and I still subscribe to today had not been as well formulated as they are today. He asserted that a literal translation would read, quote, "If anyone desire overseeing, he desires a good work." Now, to me, I cannot understand or see the difference between overseeing and that of an office of a bishop. Overseeing is a specific work that is given to specific men that's not given necessarily to the other members of the congregation. Therefore, there is a difference between the position of the elders in the congregation versus those individuals of the congregation and their particular responsibilities. Now, he goes on to say that the work of the elders is to instruct, to admonish, to encourage, and to strengthen the disciples and direct, and the word left out of this is them in worship. And truly, this, I would have no argument with this statement. I do believe that's part of the work of the elders, but I believe it goes beyond that. And we'll deal with that in the lesson next week. Tonight we're talking about his position, his thinking, and what he's trying to get across to individuals of his day and time. Lipscomb said, "But cannot they do this as well before as after their ordination? And is it not the duty of every Christian to have this same care one for another and for the well-being of the church as a whole?" The use of this word ordination is another one of the inconsistencies, I think, in his argument. One, first of all, if you are ordained, it means you are appointed. You are placed in, you are positioned in, you are given a particular work and duty. He seems to think that every member in the congregation has the same responsibilities. I've taken the position a great number of years ago as I felt like that it was the responsibility of every man in the congregation to get themselves qualified to serve as elders, so that if the time came that you were needed, that it would not be a long, laborious trek trying to find someone that would fit into that position. It's difficult. It's hard. It's a lofty goal to reach, and most men don't really get that far in their life. Some don't want to. Some may not have the capabilities, and there are some that just absolutely, even though they're qualified and would make great elders, will tell you, "No, I will not serve." And if they have that attitude, they're disqualified, because one has to have a desire for the work. And that does not mean that you lust after it. That does not mean that you are constantly working and weaving your way through the social aspects of the congregation in order to get tagged for that at some time in your life. The idea of and we'll talk about this a little more next week. Lipscomb said that the elder's work is a work in which any may engage, but which is especially assigned to certain ones on account of fitness, of character, and aptitude. Now notice, in this statement he says assigned. In the last statement that we looked at, he said that they were ordained. This is a milder terminology, but it fits more to the character of the idea that he was trying to get across, that he felt like there were no offices as such in the church itself. And truly, this fits the concept that I was talking about, that any man in the congregation can basically do the same work of any of the men that have been appointed as elders. Most do not, but the whole concept is that here, as we have grown to be more like Jesus Christ, then we find ourselves doing more of the same thing that Jesus was doing, and that is reaching out to those that are lost, reaching out to those that have difficulties in life, and doing what we can to bring peace and contentment into their life. Lipscomb said, We believe that no office in the church invests with a particle of authority. Again, this is inconsistent with his other statements, because he says that there evidently is an office in the church if it has no authority. So this is an up and down thing. It's something that bounces around, and it's hard to get a finger on it sometimes. But this was simply his position, this was his belief, and what he was trying to get across to others. To him, as he said, office simply means duty. It places upon one the obligation to do a certain work. It gives no authority or power, and elders are not to rule by official authority or power, but to do it in love. Again, if someone is assigned to open and close the church building, and then that's his duty and responsibility. Now, you can call it an office or you don't call it an office. It doesn't make any difference whether you do or not. But he's given a duty, he's given a responsibility, he's given a work to do that particular thing. In a technicality, when you have set aside someone for a work, you have basically given them authority to do this. If you have a football team and you tag a fella and said, you're going to be the quarterback, he's not going to line up as a tight end, simply because he knows where his responsibilities are, and that's what he's been given to do, and his authority is to get the ball when it's hiked and to either hand it off to somebody to run or to throw it to somebody or to get tackled behind the line. You know, it doesn't make a lot of difference sometimes where you are. But I agree with it, to do this in love. It's been unfortunate at times that some men have been appointed as elders in a congregation against their will. If they say, well, I'll do it if nobody else will. Congregation's in trouble to start with. Here's a person who's taking over a job with reluctance of not really wanting to do what needs to be done. A good eldership works together. It doesn't mean they're not going to have disagreements. It doesn't mean that they're not going to be at odds with each other from time to time. It's going to happen. It happens anytime that you get two individuals together. You don't always have total, complete autonomy of what takes place.
And then there's the elder who was appointed an elder because they think he's going to die and they want him to die happy, so because he's an elder.
Yeah. I don't know if you heard exactly what she said, but this was a situation that we were in at one time, that we had a man in the congregation who had a multiplicity of heart attacks. And some in the congregation, even in eldership, wanted to appoint him an elder because he could be an elder when he died, and that would be one of the highest glories that he would ever achieve in his life. It was a touchy situation by any means. Lipscomb said the authority of elders did not reside in any office or appointment, but was simply a moral authority rooted in character and faithfulness. I think I have to agree with that to some degree, because first of all, if you do not agree with the elders, you probably need to go and talk to them. It may first of all be a matter of misunderstanding on your part. Two, it may also be that you are at odds of the direction that congregation is going. And you have the right as an individual to withdraw yourself from that congregation if you can't agree with the direction that it's going. The elders can't say to you, you can't go somewhere, that you're a member of this congregation, you can't go anywhere else. They can't do that because we have individual responsibilities as human beings, and also we have personal opinions sometimes. Now, we're not always going to agree with what the elders get together and agree upon. It may be the color of the carpet that goes down in the auditorium. It may be whether or not we have bright lights or dim lights. Some of you are old enough to remember when some people wanted to introduce 16 millimeter film like the Herald of Truth, and to show that maybe once a month in the congregation. That was anathema. Man, that was just terrible. To have sound features in a congregation and to have a movie that was there. And I can remember in times how hard that it was even to show the Jewel Miller film strips to a class and to share with them the teaching from those. It was simply the Bible, simply using a different means and method. And I suspect that Lipscomb would probably, if he had lived in the time in which we had the audiovisual aids that we have today, would have been against them. He would want to know where in the Scriptures that you could find an illustration of this being done. I've got one. You remember when Jesus stooped down and drew in the dirt? Visual aids. See, be careful where you take a stand sometimes, because it may be on the edge of a high cliff. Jesus used illustration. He also at one time took a small child upon his lap. And again, a visual illustration to teach a lesson. So there's nothing wrong in this. I think sometimes in the way that it's used, it may get a little on the fuzzy side. He said, controlling the church by virtue of authority of office is unknown in the Scriptures, and all should seek to control simply and only through the authority of truth impressed by lives of godliness, purity, and love. Yeah.
Because the elders, they have a work to do and a responsibility, and they have been given an authority to do that work, but it's not a matter of control of the congregation.
No, I think it's more of a matter of unifying difficulties that arise. I think I've used this illustration once before in one place where I was preaching. I've been there about 3 years. And every time that I stood up on Sunday, this fellow on this side got up and walked out. And the elders asked me, he said, were you and brother having problems? And I said, no, not that I know of. And he said, well, we need to get you two together and figure out what's going on. Well, his position, his thinking was, and this is not quite a quote, but this was the position that he had taken. He said, Paul never stayed more than 3 years in one place, and Brother Wallace has been here 3 years. It's time for him to go. He had no problems with me or what I was teaching. He said, it was just time for me to go. And that was his position. I stayed around a little longer than that, but I think it got a little better. I'm not sure. Given this view of elders' authority, Lipscomb was clear about how one became an elder. Let me back up to this thing about control that Judy pointed out. I don't think that the average Christian is really concerned or wants to control anybody else. And I think many times if there is a difficulty that arises either between brothers or sisters or brothers and sisters, that most would rather somebody else handle it. We would rather somebody else get involved with it and soothe it over, smooth it over, settle it, or at least separate them. You know, one time I was in fact, this was the first place I ever preached. A good friend of mine that was a government representative there in the community. He took me out one day and he said he was going to show me part of the county. He was county agent, I think, is what his position was. As we were driving through the community, we came on this big, beautiful brick church building. And I said, man, I didn't know there was that big a church in this whole county. He said, yeah. He said, this is a black congregation that meets out here. And I said, well, I've never seen one that big out in the countryside. He said, well, I'll tell you the story about it. He said, I said, well, is it a huge congregation? He says, no, there's only about 40 or 50 members that are there. And it was close to the size of the inward parts of this building right here. And I said, well, why do they have such a big building? He said, they can't get along with each other. I said, what? He said, yeah. He says, there's one little group that sits over here that can't get along with this little group that sits over here and a little group that sits over there. And they all come together, but they sit in different places because they can't get along together. Well, I guess that solves the problem to some degree, but there was evidently no unity in that congregation. The purpose of an eldership is to maintain and keep this unity within the congregation and to deal with problems before they become immense problems. Lipscomb was clear about how one became an elder, because if there are no offices, how does one get into this position or this work? He said it was not by election or appointment. He said it was not by just stepping into some office. He said it was by doing the work of an elder that one becomes an elder. Now, I really don't believe that if I strapped on a gun, put on a badge, and flashed my lights in my car at somebody that was speeding would make me a police officer. And the police officers would certainly frown upon that. And so we have to be very careful that within the confines of the church that Jesus established, that we're looking at the principles of why things existed and why they're there. He said that one becomes an elder or a deacon, quote, just as carpenters and blacksmiths are made by laboring, studying, practicing the things in which they're engaged. And in the day in which he wrote this, most of these particular crafts were practiced by having a young person come in and study and follow the work of an experienced individual. What were those called? I can't hear you. Apprentices, right? Okay. See, it takes a big crowbar sometimes to get adults to respond, but thank you. I appreciate it. I've been trying for 50 years to do it. It still doesn't work. Yeah. Or megaphones for people to speak louder. Or both. And that solves the problem. Gets both of them. He says then the congregation just simply recognizes their work. Okay, thank you, Mr. Lipscomb. It does this not by holding an election, but by looking out from among themselves, that is, by conferring together to see who possesses the qualifications, and who is already doing the work. That's what I thought it was. And appointing them, and as he said earlier, ordaining. And again, all of this doesn't really gel into something that is just really solid. And I hope that you saw this when you were reading this. It says, when the congregation agrees upon who that is, then the Holy Spirit has already appointed such bishops and deacons. I mean, they're elders and deacons before they know they're elders and deacons, huh? Now, that's basically what he said here. He says that it's not in the hands of the people of the congregation, except he says the congregation is supposed to seek out from among themselves. Well, again, it just doesn't gel into being something that's really good. To him, a formal ordination was not necessary. But you do have to announce to the congregation that this individual is now one of the elders or one of the deacons of the congregation, or they will never know it. True? I think so. He said, as far as we have observed, he wrote in 1877, the electing and setting apart of officers has been a complete farce in the churches. Well, undoubtedly, this brought an awful lot of letters to the Gospel Advocate, in which people were really upset at the position that he had taken and that he was proclaiming at this particular part. He said that the usual plan of appointing them, elders or deacons, is for a few of the active and influential brethren to confer among themselves as to who carries the most weight and would make the church the most respectable with respectable people, agree among themselves, someone nominates him publicly, a few vote for him, the rest do not vote, not liking to vote publicly against a brother, and they, the people, get 2 or 3 preachers and an officer to lay their hands upon the heads of those elected, kneel down and pray, and then declare himself inducted into office. Again, this inconsistency crops up, and we says 2 or 3 preachers and an officer. Well, who would that officer be? More likely than not, one of the elders of the congregation. Now, one of the things that we're going to talk about is what happened in Acts next week, is what happened in Acts, the 15th chapter, and the conference that took place in Jerusalem and the decision that was made there. So I think Lipscomb at this particular point had not really completely thought through the position that he was taking. He said that any man or set of men who attempts to exercise authority in a church by virtue of some official appointment, or to assert that they have rights and authority as officers above others and assume or exert their rights without the full approval of the members, are lording it over the flock. When we appoint a man to lead singing, do you choose the song that you're going to sing, or do you sing the song that he's chosen? Now, suppose one Sunday when Mark got up here and he announced, we're going to sing number 701, and 3 over here decide they don't want to sing that, we're going to sing something else, and they're all going to sing something else, and you're all going to sing something else. How effective is that going to be in teaching the lessons that's found in the song? Not going to be very effective. We give him the authority to pick out the songs, regardless of whether this is, quote, an official or unofficial. We always say he's the song leader. And then we have somebody else appointed to preach a lesson, or to teach a Bible class, or to wait on the Lord's table. So there are different offices, not necessarily in the sense of a dictatorial circumstance, but in a position where action is taking place, and unity is brought together as a result of the decision of that individual or a combination of individuals. Here he says you got to get the whole group together. We can't get that done on Wednesday night. We can't get that done on Sunday morning for Bible class. We can't get that done at church services on Sunday morning. We're scattered far and abroad everywhere, so if we have a meeting and make a decision on it, what about somebody that couldn't make it that day or had a flat tire and couldn't get here? They're going to be upset. Well, we need to learn to get over it. We need to learn to have love in our heart and say, okay, that's fine. I wasn't here. I didn't have my input. Okay, maybe next time. But we get our nose all out of joint sometimes over things that we may not have all the information about, and really doesn't make an awful lot of difference. It won't make a difference in 100 years anyway. A church's decision should be the decision of the church as a whole, Lipscomb thought, not arbitrary rulings based on elders' authority. Now, the concept that I mentioned earlier about the men's business meetings, I think applies in this situation. Because most of the time, if you get 20 people together, you're probably going to get 25 different opinions. That's just the way that it is. And if you get together and you say, okay, we're coming together for this, to make a decision on this, and we want your input on this, you're still going to get a wide variety of ideas of things that need to be done. And that's simply because everybody wants to put their 2 cents worth in. Well, it's a nickel today. Inflation's got the 2 cents. Elders should voice the judgment of the church. They can do this only by consulting all. At times, at most times, and probably at all times, that's not possible. If that's true, what about our senior citizens that are in the dementia areas of senior citizens? They're members. What kind of decisions do you think that they might make? Or would they even be concerned about it or even think about it?
We'd never get anything done if everybody had to say this is it.
The old saying, everybody's business is nobody's business. If everybody's in charge, nobody's in charge. And that way, you don't accomplish anything. This means that they must consider the complaints and desires of the humblest member, which, people sometimes say, well, nobody asked me. Well, we've got elders that you can go to and say, hey, I need to talk to you. Can we sit down and talk about this for a minute? This is something that bothers me, or this is something that I think is really important. And everybody's got good ideas. Some of them are just more cuckoo than the others, but they've got good ideas.
And we all have a responsibility.
Yes. Yeah. It's just like saying, I don't know if you drink tea or not. If you drink tea, you're supposed to stick out your pinky finger. Actually, the British say you're not supposed to do that. That's an American interpretation of the way that the British do it. And the whole point of that would be, why is that done? It's because that's the way that's always been done. Never thought about that. And most of the time, we do things the way we've always done them, and we've never really thought about why we do that. Do you think that it would be a big deal next Sunday if we had the Lord's Supper the last thing of the service? There'd be people up here by the time the preacher got up, they'd be looking around wanting to know what's going on. There's something different that's happening here. And what would even be more interesting if all these people on this side sat over here next Sunday and all these people over here sat over here. Man, that would really upset all the people in the middle. We wouldn't know where anybody was. Lipscomb said, an official board of elders and deacons creates different expectations. People tend to assume that such officers have a special authority, that they are assigned to work that no one else can do, and so members elect their officers and then assume it is the officer's duty to look after the church interest and the members can rest in ease. I got news. They're going to rest in ease no matter what. They're not until something goes against what they think or believe, and then they're going to come unglued. William Lipscomb, who was David Lipscomb's brother, took the position that such an unscriptural system, the electing of elders and deacons as an office, tends to regard Christians as fledglings with mouths agape, ready to receive dainty morsels provided and prepared by human manipulation. He's referring to that as less like little baby birds sitting in a nest. Mama bird comes along or Papa bird comes along, got a big fat worm, and whoever squeaks the loudest gets it first. It views them as timid lambs needing watchdog protection. If that didn't stir up an awful lot of folks, then they couldn't be stirred up. To talk about people that couldn't think on their own, couldn't make decisions on their own, etc. Christians certainly need encouragement and exhortation from wise old Christians, he added, but not the control of the so-called eldership. Well, that was his opinion. E.G. Sewell, Lipscomb's longtime editorial associate at the Gospel Advocate, fully shared Lipscomb's strictures against officialism. See, they even gave it a name, officialism. After surveying each use of the term elder in the New Testament, he insisted that the term referred to nothing more than age. It was never used as an official term, but referred to only the senior members in the congregation. How does he know that? He didn't live back in that day and time.
Yeah. Acts 14:23 says that they appointed elders for them in the various churches.
Yeah.
And that didn't mean that they said they chose this one to be an older person.
Yeah.
We all get older.
Yeah, faster and faster. He even argued that the elder women mentioned in 1 Timothy 5:2 are just as much officers as the older men are. Neither were actually officers in the church, he concluded, rather both made up the senior members who led the congregation by their example and teaching. So seniors, we can rise up and take over. No, that's not. You have to remember, these men were still emerging in the understanding of what the Scriptures were teaching. Lipscomb and his circle of editorial colleagues stood firmly against the tide of incorporation that swept America and the American churches in the late 19th century. They said that worldly forms of power and authority, however efficient and cost-effective they might prove, had no place in God's scheme of things. If that statement is really true, why do we have songbooks? And why do we have Bibles? If you know the Word of God like you ought to know the Word of God, you don't need the written page. Wow. And yet, the position that some of these people took was, well, what is a songbook? What is a written Bible? They're aids for me to study and to know and to better, and to go back and say, I read that, but I'm not too sure about it, but I'm going back and look at it again.
Well, if you go all the way back to the beginning, God created order in the very beginning. And throughout history from that point on, even when he chose the Jews to be his chosen people, he created order in that. And when he separated them as a nation and to be his people, he created them he created an eldership in that. It wasn't just every old man but it was, he appointed the elders of each family to be responsible for guiding and teaching and making decisions for the rest of the family.
You're preaching my lesson for next week and you haven't even seen my notes. See, good minds think in the same direction. Finally, they felt God's kingdom stood in a sharp contrast to all the kingdoms and institutions of this world. Now be very careful to see where this is headed. God was creating a new order, and one day God would establish that new order over all the earth. And in the meantime, Lipscomb thought, God sought wise and willing workers, not elected officers, to lead the way. Now, I don't know what your position on is, whether or not that you believe that Jesus is coming back to rule the earth for 1,000 years or not. That's not germane to what this is. But here is a position that this man has taken, and he establishes his thinking upon what he believes is going to happen. And he's trying to prop it up to the point where, and I can see basically where he's coming from and where he's trying to go. And we'll use this next week. Jesus said, all authority in heaven and on earth is given to me. But he also appointed 12 men to go out and preach the gospel to the entire world. And they were ordained as apostles, appointed as apostles, selected as apostles. Sometimes it's a matter of semantics, and we have to be very careful. Next week, we're going to have a lesson on elders, church government, and where we stand today. Thank you for your participation tonight. Thank you for getting into my lesson for next week. The preview is very good. Appreciate that. Okay. We'll see you.